Okay, I want to talk about an argument for atheism, an argument for the thesis that God does not exist. It may not be the best argument for atheism, but it is very widespread. It's popular. It stirs up feelings, it stirs up families, and it's the kind of argument you would overhear at a coffee shop, or the kind of argument that's probably taking place late into the night in a dorm room or a frat house. It's the kind of argument that would show up at a Thanksgiving Day table. It's the kind of argument that it's worth thinking through seriously. And I want to do that by taking different perspectives of at least three participants in the argument: the theist, the atheist, the agnostic, and seeing if I can figure out what the strategies for attack and defense should be. What should each participant in the debate be trying to do at each stage of the debate? And part of my device for thinking my way through will be to tell you a story about halfway through this talk. I think the story is helpful because it has features that don't stir up emotions. And it's easier to get a verdict about the right thing to think regarding the story, and then on the assumption that the story is relevantly similar to the case I want to talk about, you can just transfer those verdicts over. So I'll tell you when the story is at hand, but first I just want to get the argument out in front of you. And so I want to begin by taking the perspective of the atheist and saying some things about evil, saying some things about God, and then saying something about the tension that results from the first two things I say. That's the preview. Here we go. April 30th, 1991 was a very good day. It's a great day for me. It's the day I defended my dissertation. And my memory is being surrounded by beloved mentors and family members and friends, feeling accomplished, feeling excited, feeling relieved, feeling blessed, feeling loved. The world was a rosy place. But now I look back on that, and I think I suffered from a kind of defect that I wouldn't be surprised if you suffer from too. And it's a defect to judge the way the world is by your own little corner of it. And it came to my attention a few days later that on that very same day when I was so happy, a tropical cyclone slammed into southeastern Bangladesh, killing 138,000 people and displacing, rendering homeless over 10 million more, and of course destroying, injuring all sorts of non-human animals that suffered and died right along with their human counterparts. This was horrific, a horrific evil. In fact, it was so bad that it counts as one of the 10 worst natural disasters in the entire 20th century. But even with a status like that, it's only a drop in the bucket of the pain and the suffering that characterizes the history of our world. Not just for centuries, not just for millennia, but for millions and millions of years. Confused, terrified animals have ripped each other limb from limb in a desperate attempt to satiate their hunger pains. And then for a briefer period of time, rational creatures have brought intelligence and cruelty to the table, revealing new and astonishing and revolting depths of suffering. And nature doesn't want to be outdone. So nature has contributed a steady stream of floods and droughts and hurricanes and tornadoes and volcanoes, twisters and cyclones, and if you give it enough time, it's sure to throw in an asteroid or a comet strike to round it all out. So uncontroversially, there's evil. Again, trying to present the beginning of the atheistic case. Now, I endorse that. Some people don't endorse that. Some people say, I'm not so sure there's any evil at all. And some of these attempts to deny that there's any evil in the world are confused. Some of them are backed by philosophical arguments that strike me as having next to no force whatsoever. Some of them are disingenuous. You'll find the occasional person who says, what you need to understand is that these evils, one and all, whether you realize it or not, each contribute to some good, some greater good. And so they aren't really evils at all. Now, I was okay with that speech right up until the last sentence. That is, I agree that there are some things that are intrinsically evil. That is, they're bad all by themselves. And I agree that some things that meet that description have an extra feature. They can contribute to states of affairs that are good. But I don't want to confuse the true thesis that some intrinsic evils are also extrinsic goods with the false thesis that there aren't any evils to begin with. That true thesis is important. I mean, that's exactly the sort of thing that somebody wants to appeal to if they want to give a justification for permitting certain kinds of evils to occur. But again, it's not a way of saying there aren't evils in the first place. Or sometimes you'll have a particular claim about an evil state of affairs, and somebody will say, who are you to say? What are you doing telling us which things are evil, which things are good? And it's kind of a conversation stopper. That who are you to say question is a call for credentials. But what I really think is often behind it is this idea that maybe we're not in a position to have justified beliefs about these matters. Maybe we're not in a position to have a full-blown theory of value, nearly universally agreed upon, that we can confidently rush out and start labeling states of affairs with. But the same people who express a kind of hesitancy here don't hold themselves to that impossible standard in other areas of thought. That is, they take stands, they apply principles, even if they lack a full-blown analysis that has nearly universal agreement. And in particular, they take stands about value judgments 10 seconds after they question anybody's right to do this. You don't need a full-blown theory. It will be enough to recognize that there are certain kinds of things that are bad. And pain and suffering, I mean, hedonism, the theory, may not be true that says the only evils are pains and sufferings. But chances are, whatever pluralistic theory is right, pains and sufferings show up on the list. They're bad, even if they're also extrinsically good. For those who doubt that pain and suffering is bad, demonstrations can be arranged after the show. All right. There's some evil. Set that aside. We're going to need it later. Second, about the term God. Sometimes this term gets used as a proper name, like Hud is a proper name. And so the debate is about whether or not it has a bearer, whether it names anything. Sometimes the word God gets used as a kind of abbreviation, a shorthand for a description. An individual that has such and such features. And whichever way you use it, you can entertain this sentence. If God exists, then God is essentially omnipotent, essentially omniscient, essentially perfectly good. And when I say essentially, what I'm adding there is not only does God have these features, but it's impossible that God exists without them. In every conceivable, possible state of affairs, God also has those three properties. Now, if it's a name, that thesis is a substantive philosophical matter. But if it's a description, that thesis could be a mere analytic truth. You could prove its truth in the same way you'd show that bachelors are unmarried, by saying something about the meanings of the terms that you would use to express it. I don't want to take a hard stand about that. I just wanted you to consider that conditional. If God exists, God's omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good. And a number of people that this argument is aimed against are willing to grant those things. They don't want to take one of them back. That would impoverish their conception of God. So in order to generate the conflict between what I've said about the evil and what I've just said about how I want to interpret God's nature, I want to say a little bit about what it would take to have these three features. So what I'm going to say next is sort of controversial, but it's one way you can go, and it's a way that I think is pretty representative. So I'm not so much endorsing as I am describing a perfectly plausible way of thinking about these divine attributes. First, with respect to omnipotence. If I say that something's omnipotent, I'm saying for every metaphysically possible way that this being could be engaged in action, it's under that being's control whether or not it's engaged in that kind of an action. For any state of affairs that it's possible for that being to be engaged in, it's up to it whether the state of affairs obtains or is prevented. So, of course, I'm not omnipotent. It's metaphysically possible that I run a 5.5-minute mile. That's not under my control. It's metaphysically possible that I levitate. That's not under my control. But something that's omnipotent, under its control. Second, when I say that something's omniscient, I'm just saying that for each truth, it knows that truth. And it doesn't matter how boring or mundane the truth is. I mean, it knows the distance in millimeters from my nose to yours on April 30th of last year when midnight struck. Any truth known by this being. You could add some other stuff. You could say it also doesn't believe any falsehood. Some people think that's a substantive addition. But what I care about is no truth escapes its notice. And when I say that it's perfectly good, I'm really packing a lot into that. So here's a little list. When I say that it's perfectly good, I mean it never does anything wrong from a moral point of view. It never does anything blameworthy from a moral point of view. It has one of the unsurpassable sets of virtues. And it's motivated, but not determined, not constrained. Merely motivated to produce good states of affairs, to sustain good states of affairs that are already in existence, to prevent bad states of affairs, and to eradicate bad states of affairs that are already in existence. So it does the right thing for the right motives, with the right character, has the right sorts of motivations. All of that involved in perfect goodness. Suppose I put those two stories together. I have an immediate tension. There are different ways to describe the tension, but this one will do. If God exists, then, due to omniscience, God knows where the evil is. A little bit more controversially, God also knows where evil is about to occur unless there's divine intervention. Second, due to perfect goodness, God's motivated to eradicate the evil that's already present, to prevent the evil that's about to occur without divine intervention. Due to omnipotence, God's able to do what God knows how to do and God's motivated to do. Upshot, that gets done. There isn't any evil, or if there is some, it's not around for long. But then you just consult the history books, and the world tells a very different story. One long, painful story of evil at every turn. But there wouldn't be those things if God thus described existed. So God thus described doesn't exist. That was a good line to enter on. That was the upshot of the first characterization of the first argument. God doesn't exist. The kind of intensity and magnitude and duration and distribution of evil in the world counts against it. Okay, I now stop thinking as the atheist. I try to take the perspective of the theist. What should the theist be thinking? And the theist can have this thought. That's looking pretty good. I don't want to give up this claim that there's some evil. I don't want to give up that sort of classical characterization of what God would be like if there's a God. Maybe I can interfere with one of those premises. Maybe, in particular, God could know all about the evil and be capable of doing something about it and be motivated to do something about it and not do anything about it without impugning moral character. Why? Well, I don't know. Here's a start. Sometimes I'm aware of something that I regard as bad, intrinsically bad. I'm able to prevent it. I see it coming. I'm motivated to prevent it, and I don't because I've got a moral reason that pulls me in the other direction. I mean, sometimes it's not just indifference, but sometimes it's a conflict of moral reasons, and the more stringent one makes me stand back and refrain. So I should start thinking along that track, says the theist. Maybe God's in a situation like that too. I should get more careful about the description, though, the theist says. Maybe God has a morally justifying reason. Let that be my official term. To permit this thing that God is able to prevent but recognizes as an intrinsic evil. And sometimes in the literature on this, morally justifying reasons get talked about in terms of just one of their sort of chief representatives, compensating goods. And I want to say something about that. I will go back and forth between those two terms, but I think it's sometimes easier to get the idea of what's being argued about focusing in on compensating goods. So a compensating good is just a state of affairs, and it's a compensating good for something. It's a compensating good for an evil. And it takes two tests that you have to pass before you get this title, being a compensating good for the evil. Test number one. There has to be a necessary connection between securing that good and permitting this evil. You can't get this good or something better without permitting that evil or something equally bad or worse. Why? Why does it have to pass that test? Well, because if it didn't, and you could have the good without going by way of the route that involves the pain and suffering, then you'd be blameworthy for taking the painful route to the good. Why not go on the cheap? Get the good for free. So first test, a necessary connection between securing that good, permitting that evil. Second test, it's really got to be good enough. It can't just be a little good. It has to be a compensating good. It has to be so good that the good and the evil taken together are a better combination than you have when the good and the evil both go missing together. Better to have them both than lack them both. All right. That's just a concrete example, but it puts a lot of pressure on the thought that what makes for permissible action is just the consequences of the actions that you produce when compared to the consequences of the actions that you could have produced instead. And there are lots of moral theories. They don't agree about that as being the only relevant moral consideration. I mean, you might think it matters, but you might think that in addition to that, sometimes moral rights matter. You might think that you have entitlements, like the rights of bodily autonomy. Entitlements to decide what happens in and to and with and through your own body and its parts, and that those things matter too. Or you might think that there are particular reasons for action, just because of the type of action that it is. You might think that, as I do, if you make a promise, that an action would count as keeping that promise is a morally relevant reason in favor of performing it, no matter how good or bad the consequences might be from the performance. The morally relevant reason could be overturned, but it's the kind of thing that matters. So I don't want, when I continue to talk about compensating goods, for you to lose sight of something. It's just one route. There might be morally justifying reasons that are based on agent-centered permissions, or that are based on moral rights, or that are based on some other consideration. But for the most part, I'm going to be thinking about compensating goods. That seems pretty good, says the atheist who's been listening in. I'm glad you got kind of technical about it. Now do me a favor. It's one thing to describe what strategy you need. It's another thing to carry it out. So would you tell me what the compensating good for the horrors of the Bangladesh cyclone of 1991 is? I like that question, but I have kind of a minor point. It's one I care about. It's one I think that's often overlooked right at this stage of the debate. I'll get back to the main track in a minute, but I want to make the minor point. And this is the minor point. The theist doesn't have to answer that question. Not in this dialectical context. So I want to get the dialectical right. We have an atheist, a theist, and an agnostic. The theist could also say, not only do I believe that God exists, I think that's the most reasonable attitude. The agnostic could say, no, not only do I suspend judgment, I think that's the most reasonable attitude. The atheist could say, not only do I disbelieve, I believe that's the most reasonable attitude. And then we could turn to each one and say, can you give us some reasons that might convert us to your position about reasonable attitudes? Well, if we're listening to the theist give reasons, then we're going to ask that theist to stand up, defend the premises, give us reasons to accept the reasons. And so too for the agnostic. But currently, we're not meeting here tonight to discuss an argument presented by either the theist or the agnostic. We're listening to an atheistic argument, the kind of thing that is supposed to compel both theist and agnostic to convert to atheism. So at this stage, when the atheist has turned to the theist and says, tell me the compensating reason, I like to imagine the agnostic stepping in front and saying, wait, I already am doubtful about whether this guy can give you an answer to that question. But look, it's a general philosophical point that an inability in one of your opponents to undermine one of your premises is not itself a roundabout reason to think that it's true. We don't need to hear from him what the compensating good is. We needed a reason from you to think that there wasn't one. We've identified a way in which your argument could fail. And if he can't show that it does fail in that way, can you show that it doesn't fail in this way? Now, I like that agnostic theist joining hands there for a moment and saying, let's look for reasons to believe the premise. But having said that, now off the minor point, agreeable lot that they are, theists often rush in to answer anyway. So it's worth trying out one of the answers and seeing how people react to it. So here's a theist answer. The theist might say, take an evil, a horrific evil, like the mutilating of a child by some soldiers for the purposes of amusement alone. There, that counts. And give us the compensating good for that. And the theist might say, I'm going to try. I'm going to give you just a sketch of something called the free will defense. There's some variants on this, but this is a representative sketch. I want you to consider a state of affairs which is the existing of a community of free beings. Now, might that state of affairs pass the two tests that we identified earlier for being a compensating good for this horrific moral evil of mutilating a child by some soldiers for the purposes of amusement only? Test one. Is there a necessary connection between securing that good and permitting that evil? Well, the people who like this defense say, yeah, if you're free, you're able to do otherwise, and if you're able to do otherwise, you can misuse the freedom. Prevent the misuse, you've taken away the ability. Take away the ability, and it's not genuine freedom after all. Necessary connection between permitting some atrocities of that kind and having genuine freedom on the other. We'll come back to an evaluation of that in just a second. Second, it really is compensating. Think about the goods involved in that state of affairs. There's a special kind of value that comes into the world when people develop virtuous characters, something freedom is required for. There's a special kind of value that comes into the world when people do what they ought to do from a moral point of view, something freedom is required for. There's a special kind of value that comes into the world when people enter into free interpersonal interactions, like freely giving and receiving love, certain kinds of friendships. These are wonderful goods. Compensating goods. Better to have the moral evil and goods like that together than to lack them both. All right, that's just a statement of the way the theist might try to rush in and answer the question for that particular evil. It's a theodicy. But theodicies are often criticizable, and in fact criticized, on one of two general kinds of grounds. Either that they're not compelling in some particular or other, or they're not comprehensive. The free will defense is criticizable and has been criticized on both grounds. I just want to give you a taste of what kinds of responses can be given against this defense. So first, that point about compensating goods. I could imagine somebody saying, look, it would be loverly if we were all freely giving and receiving love. That would be a pretty fine state of affairs. But you're stacking it up against millions and millions of years of pain and suffering. And when you do, the scales look like this. It doesn't compensate. It's not even close. Now, I understand that response. And you can see what would have to happen next. You'd have to get down and start arguing about comparative value claims. And that would be an interesting philosophical argument. It's one way the free will defense has been opposed. Second, somebody might say, even if it's compensating, even if it's wonderfully good, far better than I'm giving it credit for, there really isn't that necessary connection. Why not? Well, there's this thesis called compatibilism. Compatibilism is the thesis that you can be both determined and free at the same time. If this thesis were true, you might think God could give you genuine freedom and cause you to use it in ways that would never permit the moral atrocities. That is, it would be possible to have all the goods in that state of affairs without paying the penalty of allowing the child to be mutilated for the purposes of amusement only. You could debate about compatibilism and incompatibilism. That's an interesting philosophical debate. And the free will defense has been challenged on those grounds. The other kind of challenge that I mentioned, it's also challenged on grounds of whether or not it's comprehensive. This is the one that I think worries people. The evils that I started this lecture talking about are not moral evils that result from the misuse of freedom. They were apparently bits of pain and suffering that come into the world because of the blind forces of nature sending a cyclone into southeastern Bangladesh. Even if the free will defense worked to explain why certain kinds of suffering would have to be permitted, it doesn't seem to do double duty and explain the so-called natural evils. Not unless you add something that strikes a number of people as very implausible, namely that all these cyclones and hurricanes and volcanoes are actually the result of the misuse of demons who have free will, or the misuse of extraterrestrials. I like the smiles I'm seeing, or of four spacers that are out there swirling the winds. If you don't like that addition, and I can understand why you might not, you would have a view that's quite popular about the free will defense. Even if it's successful in some quarters, it's not going to explain what's going on in the horrors from the Bangladesh cyclone. Okay. So the agnostic says, I kind of guessed that that one was going to be a failure. But again, atheist, since you have the floor, can you give us a reason to think that there's not a compensating good? That's what I'm interested in. That's what you need to tell me to convert me. So now I want to take the atheist perspective again. What's the right thing to say in response to that? Well, suppose the atheist starts thinking like this. Okay, fair enough. What I need to do is show that there's not a compensating good. What tools do I have? Well, I have an admission from everybody in the conversation that we're not aware of one. So I need a bridge premise. I need a premise that says this: if there were a compensating good or a morally justifying reason, then I'd be aware of it and I'd be able to recognize it as such. If I can defend that conditional, then I can take the admission that we are not aware of one, which was already given to me, use it with the conditional, and out rolls that conclusion, that there isn't one, the thing I was asked to produce an argument for. So I could see the atheist's attention now being riveted on that conditional. What should I think of that claim? If there were a morally justifying reason for the Bangladesh cyclone of 1991, then I'd be aware of it and I'd be able to recognize it as such. Okay. There are lots of conditionals that are like that. Some people have called them no-see-em inferences. I mean, the idea is, I don't see them, so they're probably not there. And there's not just one reaction you have to all the conditionals that have that structure. Sometimes you're absolutely convinced that they're true. Here's a case like that. If there were a pounding ache in my head right now, I'd be aware of it, and I'd be able to recognize it as a pounding ache in my head right now. When you run that thought first person, each one of you is likely to do this. Sounds right. Obviously true. Here's another one that's probably true. Not as obvious, but probably true. If there were a tiger right behind me, prowling about on the desk, you'd recognize it as a tiger right behind me prowling about on the desk. You'd be aware of it. Yeah, true. Here's one that's probably not true. Imagine we've just recovered some downed alien spacecraft, and we're over there searching through the wreckage, and we pick up something and looking at it. I wonder what this is. Maybe it's a navigation device. Maybe it's a weapon. Maybe it's something they use to prepare their food. Maybe it's a religious artifact. Huh. It's got 26 coils, this thing I'm holding. Well, here's a sentence. If there were a dietary reason for this 26 coiled object, we'd be aware of it and able to recognize it as a dietary reason. No, we wouldn't. No reason to accept that one. And then there's some cases where you're absolutely convinced that you'll reject the conditional. If there were something too complex for us to be aware of, we'd be aware of it, and we'd be able to recognize it as something too complex for us to be aware of. Obviously false. So I'm thinking, I'm running my way through where we are in the argument so far. There is this claim about evil, I grant it. There are these constraints on what something would have to be like to be God, I grant them. There's an easy tension that can be represented with an argument, and I understood it. I want to try to attack a premise by thinking maybe God refrains, even though God can do something, because God has a morally justifying reason for refraining. I put some pretty heavy conditions on one kind of morally justifying reason, a compensating good. I've tried out one answer to what a compensating good is. I wasn't so impressed with the results. I'm looking for a reason to think that there aren't any compensating goods. I have a strategy for showing that there aren't any compensating goods. It moves through one of these no-see-em inferences. And I know that sometimes those are great, sometimes they're pretty good, sometimes they're probably false, and sometimes they're clearly false. I wonder where this one goes in that classification scheme. And it seems to matter, right? If it comes out in the probably good or certainly good category, maybe I'm going to buy into the argument. So now theist, atheist, agnostic alike, they're interested in thinking about that conditional, trying to sort it. All right. I promised you a story. Here it comes. The rabbit in the garden. That's why some of you maybe showed up. It helps me think about this conditional. I've got a big garden, and it's not doing very well. And I have a suspicion about why. I think there's a rabbit out there eating stuff, and I want to know if I'm right. So I get on the phone with the A1 rabbit identification and removal service. And I say, I need your help. And they say, we'll be right down. Put it down, I wait. 20 minutes, here they come. I know, because it says A1 on their truck. They get out of the truck, I wave to them, they wave to me, and then 6 guys go and sit in the corner of the garden. One of them has a shovel. Hey, that's kind of weird. I'm watching for a while. They open up their lunch boxes, they're having some lunch, they're clearly having a good time, having a conversation. Every once in a while, the big one takes the shovel and kind of pounds the ground around him. That's weirder, I'm thinking, but okay. About after 2 hours of this, the foreman comes up to the door, knocks at the door. Yeah? You don't got a rabbit out there. Okay. Why do you think so? Well, because if you had a rabbit out there, we'd be aware of it, we'd be able to recognize it, and we're not aware of any rabbits. Okay? I like the argument, right? I've already endorsed that style of argument. I just want to know why he thinks the conditional premise is true. I don't put it that way, but I say, why do you think you'd be aware of it? And he says, well, we checked some places, Sam was hitting the places he could reach with a shovel and no rabbits left. Yeah, okay. So I like his argument, but I think he didn't do a very good job of carrying it out. Hear the good news, the bad news. The good news is, he's got a style of argument I like. It's inductive generalization. Sometimes I bet my life on that. I bet you do too. That is, he wants to know whether some target population has a certain feature. Takes a sample. The sample doesn't have the feature. Generalizes. The target population doesn't have the feature, and he comes and asks to be paid. I like the style of argument, but his sample wasn't so good. His sample, in fact, was abysmally small. I've got a big garden, and all they checked was wherever Sam could reach with a shovel. I tell them I won't pay him, I make them leave. Now, put it aside. We're going to need a lesson from that in a minute, but we don't have it yet. I still want to know if there's a rabbit in my garden. I'm still suspicious. I think I didn't really get any information there. So I get on the phone with the A2 rabbit identification and removal service. And I say, look, I need your help. They say, okay, we'll be there half an hour. Half an hour goes by. Here they come. They look serious. They start unloading stuff off the truck, all sorts of equipment, all sorts of machines. They got a machine that goes bing. They run right out into the garden. They start searching. I watch them for a while, and I just get bored because they're doing this methodical, meticulous, comprehensive search. And I go take a nap. Pretty soon, I guess not pretty soon, much later, they come knock at the door. Yeah, no rabbit. All right, how do you know? If there were a rabbit out there, we would have seen him, we would have recognized him as a rabbit. How come? We searched every rabbit hiding place. We searched every rabbit hiding place in a way that no rabbit could return to a once searched spot without setting off bells. We did a thorough job. No turnip unmolested, no lettuce unturned. Great. I like his argument too, but notice it is different, right? He didn't generalize on anything. They looked everywhere. I pay. The price was high. That was a lot of work. Now, these are the first 2 of 3 warm-up cases. But they teach me something. Time to do some transferring. I need to identify what the different pieces of the story are doing. Well, a rabbit hiding place, that's a morally justifying reason. If I find a rabbit in one of those rabbit hiding places. A rabbit's a morally justifying reason. A rabbit hiding place is the place I would find a morally justifying reason. That is an abstract state of affairs. The garden is just the range of rabbit hiding places. So what's the range of morally justifying reasons or compensating goods? The garden of abstracta, all the abstract objects. What do I have? I have 2 different strategies for surveying. I have the strategy represented by the A1 boys and the strategy represented by the A2 boys. I can have inductive generalization, I can have exhaustive search. What if what I have in fact done, when thinking hard about what the morally justifying reasons might be, turns out to be exactly like what the A1 team has done? Well, then I know something. I know that I'm engaged in a certain kind of argument that I have some respect for, inductive generalization. But if, like them, my sample is awful because it is abysmally small, I'm not especially inclined to pay up. Now, that's not the claim that what we have done is only as good as what was represented by the A1 team, but it's just a kind of warning. If it turns out to be not any better than that, I'm not going to pay. And what I mean by pay in this context is I'm not going to buy the bridge premise that's going to convert me to atheism with this argument. All right, that was lesson 1 of warm-up case 1. What about the A2 team? What does it teach me? Well, if I do what they've done, I'll pay. I'm going to convert. But now I realize that that's a dead end because they had an advantage I didn't have. They had a finite garden. It was possible to go check every rabbit hiding place in my backyard. It's not possible to check every state of affairs in the garden of abstracta. There's infinitely many of them. Even if we divided up the work, started right now, we're not going to make much of a dent. What I need is something that comes in between those 2 cases. What I need is something that doesn't pretend to have given a comprehensive search across an infinity of possibilities, something I'm clearly not equal to, but something that does a bit better than the A1 team, the kind of thing I can generalize with confidence on. So, I need another warm-up story. I wait a year. My garden's not doing very well again. Unwilling to think it's me, I suspect that there's a rabbit out there. And so I'd like to know. I'm not calling the A1 team, they were awful. I'm not calling the A2 team, they're too expensive. I get on the phone with the A3 rabbit identification and removal service. And they say, we have what you want, half an hour. Half an hour it is, they're there. They bring out the same machines. They start doing their work. I go settle in for what I think is going to be a long wait, and they come back in a little over half the time. They knock at the door. It's the conversation you're used to. What? We want to be paid. What's the verdict? No rabbit. Why? If there were a rabbit, we would have been aware of it and recognized it. Why? Well, we didn't search everything. You didn't want to pay us that much. It's a lot of work. But we searched a very large sample, in fact, a representative sample, and we generalized. And we know you like that kind of argument because we were listening to you talk earlier. It's good enough for us. I'm thinking, okay, I think that's good enough for me too, and I'm starting to write the check. Now, I think my atheist, who is thinking about this argument now from that perspective, should be feeling there's something to this. Maybe we do have a representative sample. But I want to ask a couple of more questions. I want to show you some ways that that the example could continue from here that can get you worried again. At least they get me worried. So suppose as I'm starting to put the date on the check, I say, hey guys, the business that you're in, I know you do a really careful look at the entire garden before you take your sample. Did you see the tarp that's out there? They say, oh yeah, we saw your tarp. It's a big tarp. I say, yeah, I know. Did you take any of your sample from under the tarp? No, we started to, and then we didn't. How come? Well, you got rocks and earth all over it, and you've staked it down. It was too heavy for us to lift. We took our sample from areas that didn't have a tarp over them. All right. I have one little worry now, one nagging worry, and it's this. The sample now is in danger of not being representative on the grounds that not every member of the target population had an equal chance of being selected. Now, that's not the kind of thing that they're blameworthy for. It's too heavy for them to lift, but it is the kind of thing that may infect certain judgments about their sample. I ask another question as I'm starting to write out A3 on the check. Given the business that you're in, do you agree with me that it's quite likely that if there's a rabbit out there, and I'm not saying that there is a rabbit, I'm just asking, if there's a rabbit out there that he's under the tarp? So yeah, that's quite likely. Now I'm stopping writing. Say, wait a minute. I have another nagging worry. My nagging worry now is that I have a special reason to think that the sample's not representative. I have a special reason to think that if there were a rabbit, he'd be under the tarp. But notice, it doesn't have to be that strong. Suppose I had asked the question, is there any special reason to think that if there were a rabbit, he'd be under the tarp? Suppose I get I don't know about that. I'm absolutely in the dark about that. That's something I'm in doubt about. That might be enough to generate some problems as well. If I may not have to actually believe that the sample is representative, but if I disbelieve it, or if I suspend judgment about it, that inductive generalization may not be able to do the work and support the weight that it's being asked to support in defending the bridge premise in this argument for atheism. So now, can I transfer the lessons over again? Well, what do I need? I did add an element to the rabbit story. I added a tarp on the garden. So what function was that performing? That was making some of the target population inaccessible. In this case, because it was too heavy. Is there anything that could be an analog of that feature in the garden of abstracta? Yeah, complexity would work. Now, it doesn't make it too difficult to lift, because abstract objects aren't the kinds of things that you stand in spatial relations to or lift up over your head. But it would make it the kind of thing that you couldn't then peer into. You couldn't sample that state of affairs. And by the way, I don't just mean that you can't sit down and think long and hard about it and give proper characterizations and know everything about the state of affairs. I mean something much simpler than that. You can't even get a description of this state of affairs into your head. And not because you're awful. I mean, I've got some modest capacities in this area, but abstracta can get very complex very quick, and it quickly outruns my representational capacities. There are all sorts of rabbit hiding places, so to speak, that is, candidate morally justifying reasons or candidate compensating goods that I can't even so much as have a description of that I can bring before my mind and entertain, much less properly categorize. So there's something that's the analog of the tarp in the garden. I have a little worry, the same first nagging worry I had before, namely, there's some way that my sample is not random, because it's not true that every member of the target population had an equal chance of being selected. I don't have the cognitive equipment to pull that trick off. Maybe also I'm not blameworthy for this, but my sample may still receive at least one negative description as a result. Second, I had this other question. Do I have any special reason to believe that if there were a compensating good? Now again, I'm not assuming that there is. I'm asking, is there any special reason to think that it's likely that if there were a compensating good, it would be amongst the extremely complex states of affairs? I think that's an interesting question. I mean, that's the analog of the question about the rabbit being under the tarp. And it's possible to work up some affirmative answers here, some sympathy for them. You might just think, that unlike the garden in my backyard, the vast majority of the garden of abstracta is covered by the tarp of complexity. I mean, the range of too complex to think about states of affairs significantly outdoes the range of not too complex for me to think about states of affairs. And you might just think with some sort of indifference that if there is one, it's in the complex side. Or you might say, the atheist never tires of telling us just how unfathomable is the entire and horrible history of evil in the actual world. So terrible that we can only get our minds around bits and pieces of it here and there. It wouldn't be at all surprising if the state of affairs that's supposed to stand in the special relation to that state of affairs of being a compensating good were likewise exceedingly complex. Wouldn't be surprising at all. But once again, you can ratchet down. You don't need anything that strong. If I ask myself, is it likely that if there were a morally justifying reason or a compensating good, it would be amongst the extremely complex states of affairs? If I say, I'm in the dark about that, I haven't a clue. I'm in doubt about whether that's true. Once again, the resulting argument, the inductive generalization, may not be strong enough to bear the weight that's being put on it. Because the right thing to do about my sample may be to suspend judgment about whether it's representative. One more thing. I sort of saved this one, partly because I like it and partly because I didn't want to try to do two things at once. Because that would get in the way of doing the first thing. There are other reasons apart from complexity that might explain why you wouldn't be aware of what the morally justifying reason is. One of them could sound like this. There is this literature about divine hiddenness. And in one sense, it's a kind of offshoot of the problem of evil. You might think, here's a bad thing. There's a divine being who wishes to have a certain kind of relationship with me, and I wish to have a certain kind of relationship with it, and it's within its power to bring it about that I'm absolutely aware that it exists and know what the rules are of the relationship, and yet it keeps itself from me. It doesn't, rearrange the stars in the sky to spell out Hud. Step 1 on your to-do list, and give me some instructions on how to enter into the right divine relationship. How come it doesn't do that? I want it wants it. And when people who are theists try to explain why God is hidden in certain ways, doesn't ensure that everyone who desires a relationship gets to have one, or at least gets to have the conditions for one set down by having irrefutable proof that God exists and has a certain nature. They start to give an answer like this. God quite likely has more than one goal. One goal, to have a certain kind of relationship, unification with you, eventually, but other goals too. Goals to develop certain kinds of features in its creaturely persons. Goals that not just won't be furthered by revealing himself in certain ways, but goals that will be frustrated, thwarted by doing that. And then they give candidates for these goals, wanting to develop a certain kind of trust in the creatures, wanting to develop a certain kind of faith in the creatures that's incompatible with certain kinds of incontestable proofs of existence in nature. Same sort of thought now. It wouldn't be at all surprising to me. I'm at least in the dark about this, in doubt about whether God has more than one goal, namely, a goal that would be frustrated if God were to reveal in full detail the morally justifying reasons for the tragedy of the Bangladesh cyclone of 1991. Even if those reasons are accessible to me. Complexity is one kind of TARP, divine intervention is another kind of TARP. Divine intervention motivated by reasons that would move God if God exists. A kind of TARP that I can at least be in doubt about. All right, one more thing. Go back to that bridge premise. If there were a morally justifying reason, I would be aware of it and I'd be able to recognize it as such. And notice that really I've only been putting the pressure on the first half of that I'd be aware of it. There is the other half, that I would recognize it as such. There's a couple of ways I could fail to recognize it. And so there are a couple of ways I can worry about this conditional that have to do with things other than merely being aware. And I think of this as the Elmer Fudd problem. Bugs Bunny was a cartoon hero of my childhood. And Bugs' nemesis, Elmer, was always out there shotgunning for Bugs. But he was astonishingly stupid. All Bugs had to do was hide his ears, put on a dress, and Elmer would mistake him. He would think he's anything but a rabbit. And disturbingly for a child's cartoon, we usually take him to be a prospective love interest. But the point was, Elmer didn't recognize a rabbit when he saw him. Now, all along in the warm-up cases, I was sort of spotting the A1, A2, A3 teams that they could recognize a rabbit when they saw it. But I'm not at all eager to spot myself the thesis that I can recognize a compensating good when I see it. There's a bit more involved. I may be the Elmer Fudd of compensating goods. You may be too. Notice what's at stake. I mean, there were very strong conditions put on compensating goods. Usually those work against the theist. Because like in the free will defense, you can worry about whether they've been satisfied. But here, why should I think, remember condition number one, the necessary connection condition. Why should I think that the necessary connections between secured goods and permitted evils that I'm aware of are representative of the necessary connections between secured goods and permitted evils that there are? Alternatively, the second half was it really had to be compensating. Why should I think that the goodness in a state of affairs I recognize as good is representative of the full range of goodness that it actually exhibits? I can't think of any reason to believe that if I'm aware of some state of affairs that's good, I thereby know the conditions of its realization. Or any reason to think that if I'm aware of some state of affairs that's good, I thereby know the full goodness that it exhibits. So the worry here, of course, is that maybe I was aware of the compensating good for the Bangladesh cyclone of 1991, and I mistakenly disqualified it because I was unaware of the conditions of its realization, or I was unaware of just how good it really is. I could fail in any of those ways. When I come to that realization, I'm not inclined to endorse this argument for atheism, and I would recommend to you that if you wanted to endorse atheism, you'd need to find other grounds to do it. But once again, the argument that I wanted to criticize, I didn't make the claim that it was the best argument for atheism. I merely made the claim that it was a very popular argument for atheism. But it's one in the end, despite its popularity, I can't stand behind. So, just a few closing remarks. Nothing that I've said counts as an argument for theism. I haven't been defending the claim that God exists. I haven't been defending the claim that there are morally justifying reasons or that there are compensating goods. Nothing that I've said should lead you to think that agnosticism is the most reasonable doxastic attitude. Nothing I've said should convince you that atheism is false. I wasn't interested in any of those grand achievements. All I wanted to do was trot out one reason for an atheistic position and cast some serious doubt on it. I hope that's what I did.